Right, so introductions for the purposes of today are a slightly new approach to what we're doing with President Series, and it's going to get even weirder as the year goes on. Is tonight we're going to hear from Omar and talk about what he has to talk about on tribal dynamics, and we're going to try and make sense of the cybernetics of what he's been doing, or decide that it wasn't. And I have no idea which, because I haven't heard the talk yet. In the second half, and I'm hoping they'll all turn up, James, and I'm hoping Caitlin, if she's still here, and possibly Isabel, who has booked in but not actually appeared on the screen yet, we'll talk about, I called it Discovering Cybernetics. How did they come to be doing the sort of stuff that they think is cybernetics? And again, we'll explore whether or not we think it's cybernetics, because we've all come at it from very different starting places, which where that will end up, I have absolutely no idea, but it's going to be fun finding out, which is kind of the point of the exercise. Omar is going to talk about tribal dynamics, a session that I think you first did at the Cybernetics conversation back in May, which half of us at least couldn't go to because we were doing something else at the time. And so we invited Omar to give it a reprise for this afternoon, and no doubt the script has been massively updated and changed, Omar, but I won't know because I wasn't there. So over to you, old chap. You've got half an hour-ish to do your thing.
Sure. I'll put my screen up. Should work. Can everyone see the screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Brilliant. So the topic is quite big, and I'll have to cut it really short. So everyone, please forgive me if I miss the majority of stuff you guys think I should have said in the parts that I didn't say. But the topic is about trying to understand insurgencies by understanding their cultural, tribal dynamics, and how cybernetics can help understand why certain structures arise from tribal dynamics and then aid insurgencies. And just a quick example, the majority of the time when we hear about the Taliban, or anytime we hear about insurgencies, anytime we hear about groups fighting the government, or we think of them as an organization. And this is the model that is usually used. This is from the BBC, where you would see the leader of the group, various political figures, a ministry such as intelligence, economic. And so we'd imagine them to be something like the NHS or the British government or the army, structured, and you can see where the information comes from and goes with enough research, and also find out where the weak spots are or the leverage points. And the overview of this discussion, we will probably not get to the second part, but the first part is, okay, how can we then try and understand the Taliban before anything else? And with a lot of defense literature, I found that it was quite weak, mainly because they envisioned the Taliban as one cohesive whole. And those minor literature that didn't conceive them as that were usually very deductive in their reasoning. And a lot of the times they based their reasoning on axioms that were usually not true. A lot of the research they did had problems because they would always try and measure the organization based on what they thought an organization should look like. And then came along a guy called Stanley McChrystal, where he was the head, I believe, of ISAF for a few years in Afghanistan. And he realized it's nothing like that. The Taliban in themselves are not an actual group. There is a hierarchy and a religious authority within them. But 99% of the fighters are not under an organization. They act according to the dynamics around them. And if those dynamics help them achieve their very situational goals, then they would align with the Taliban. And it gets to, one sense is, it gets to why they're able to do that. I mean, it's not very easy to be able to do something like that in a highly complex environment. And I tried to look for a place where that might be. Is it, I don't know, are they leading management literature, or are they trying to base it off Islamic ideals of governance? It was none of that. The ideas I was trying to look for that they were following, or something substantive, had to be open enough to allow an immense amount of interactions, almost like a network, but at the same time constrained enough that it allowed to be matched with Taliban goals. And so the codes of conduct the Taliban use is a tribal code called Pakhtunwali. It has 14 to 16 different laws you have to follow, such as helping the people that can't be helped, allowing people to come to your house. If they need aid, you have to open your door. And then I started to realize a lot of the codes had to do with how groups should interact with each other. Where one example is, if there are two tribes or two groups fighting over resources, they have to hold something called a jirga, a mass meeting with all the local sub-tribes, tribes, tribal heads, religious heads, local government. They all sit down and talk about it, share information. Then I started to realize this might be the place, well, at least the first tranche that causes them the way to be so effective. The second tranche was Islam. It gave a shared meaning, what I found was that it almost gravitated you towards people that were Muslim, but pushed you away from people that weren't. And so the tribal dynamics and Islam acted as these two forces. And then there was the central hierarchy, telling them, okay, what they tried to do was align Islam and tribal dynamics towards their goals. And then I thought, okay, I can use the VSM for that. And I quickly found that it can't be used, not because the VSM doesn't work to understand organizations, but that the Taliban were not an organization. They were open, well, you can put it in a frame of reference or see it as an open system that works on positive feedback rather than negative feedback, that doesn't try to dampen oscillations, but many times oscillations are what drive it. And then I moved towards trying to understand as a complex system, as multiple interacting entities at different scales. And at different scales, they would have different behaviors. And to give a quick summary of what complexity theory says about emergent phenomena from complex interactions is they can be random, coherent, or correlated. So I imagined if we have multiple viable systems and non-viable systems that die off pretty quickly, and emergent phenomena arising from these interactions, there are certain types of behaviors they would produce. So extremely rigid organizations would be very coherent. Whatever the leader says would occur. There's very low variety. It's an example would be looking at an atom in a cannonball. By looking at it, you can determine where all the other atoms would be. Then there are correlated, where they're not necessarily the components of an organization or a system that you're observing are not too tightly coupled together to be coherent, but not too random for there to be very few system structures to guide a more unified actions. And well, that just explains what I've just said. The Taliban dynamics were based on the tribal codes, which also presumed decentralization of authority, individuality and freedom, and decision-making autonomy. That part wasn't directly stated in the Pashtun tribal codes. You can be free, you can do what you want, but it nudges the person reading it to be like that. For example, every Pashtun is his own theologian, is his own master, is his own guard, things like that. And so I thought, let's try and make a model about this. We have the Islamic influence that tries to couple them together. We have the tribal dynamics that provides, let's say, the codes of interaction between interacting groups and agents, and the central authority that tries to get these groupings and tribes to work towards Taliban goals. And it came up into something like this. I mean, it's not very obvious, but it does illustrate the point that if you are observing at the highest scale, I'll zoom in for some of you. If you're observing at the highest scale, oh yes, this is the Haqqani network, this is the traditional Taliban, and then there's this type of central bureaucratic authority. Traditional Taliban have different types of beliefs about Islam, Haqqani have more extreme views, and then you have the tribes that are trying to survive. A lot of defense literature, well, the best defense literature only gets to this point, where we have different major groups fighting each other. The Barakzai tribe, for example, in Helmand, these guys have a leader and everyone follows the leader, and they're quite a coherent system. The chaos, in fact, is how they're all interacting with each other.
Sorry, say that again, the chaos?
The chaos comes from this higher level organizations interacting with each other, is what the defense literature saw. So at this highest level, they believe that it's a coherent set of behaviors of what we call, Taliban and related Taliban phenomena.
Sorry, can you just confirm, are you talking about chaos in terms of complexity theory notion or the more general
More
meaning?
more general. This is what the defense literature saw. It's very chaotic. It must arise from the interactions between them. But generally speaking, with all those interactions, these Haqqani networks, central authority and Taliban act as a coherent system. Within themselves, within the Haqqani, the central authority, the Alizai tribe, for example, they're coherent. We can understand they have a leader, they have a supposedly obvious organizational structure. Luckily, I had some family and friends in Afghanistan. And over the years, I've tried to get a lot of information of how it actually works. They themselves obviously don't see what we see right now in this image. What they see is their immediate surroundings. And so I contacted one of the tribe heads and asked him, so how do you lead your supposed organization? It turns out he doesn't. He nudges it. There is no formal information structures. There are no formal decision-making structures. There's no, system 5, system 4, system 3. It's multiple interacting systems. A lot of them are not viable. They survive for a few weeks and then die off. They're interacting with each other to produce the phenomena that we call the Alizai leadership even, or the Alizai tribe, or a sub-tribe 4 or sub-tribe 3, wherever they are. And the types of behavior they had were correlated. So if an event in the wider environment would happen, their actions would be very correlated for the moment for that specific problem that would arise, and then they would go back to totally different structures, totally different links. And that was very confusing because the majority of insurgencies try to look for uniformity in action. They want to know the sub-tribe 4 in this valley is under the Alizai leadership. So if we tell the Alizai leadership, don't do that, or we'll put you in prison, the Alizai leadership officially says, yeah, okay, I'll tell them because I'm the big guy here, or our council is the big guy. In reality, he has no control over them. He only has control for a moment, depending on the wider environmental factors. And it started to get even more interesting because I went even deeper to what I call the subgroupings, but that means at the moment, at a certain time frame, in a certain situation, a group forms. Maybe it's 2 different tribes in one, maybe it's one tribe, maybe it's 2 different ideological groupings in 2 different, it's very complex. But they would group together for a moment with different families. And I found very quickly that it is extremely complex in a complexity theory sense, meaning that these groupings were emergent from the wider environment, and that environment was almost always nonlinear. many of these families and groupings had no idea that their actions would cascade to a totally new environment within a day even, and that they had to reorientate themselves as quickly as possible. Within the families and the members, because of tribal culture, they are allowed to go to different tribes, not necessarily to join the tribe, although they would do that with marriage, but in order to fulfill their immediate need or their family's need or the traditional Taliban's need or the Haqqani's need. And it would be an ever-changing and shifting dynamic. Another form that tribal culture aided this was this idea that you have to be prideful. You have to, in a sense, not let anyone do or say anything bad to you. And if they do, then you have the right to go off, leave everything you own, your family, whatever, make a small band or whatever you want to do, and try and get revenge because it's about your honor, your pride. And that is prescribed within Pashtun culture to do that. And so there would be no limitation or few limitations by families or subgroupings or such things to stop these guys going off and creating their own network. And this model that I've made is not necessarily just, out of thin air, combining the three. It's in fact how individual members of Pashtun tribal society see their environment. They're able to couple together different scales and prescribe certain actions and ideas to those scales. So when you're talking at the level of family, they interact in a certain way. When you're talking to the level of tribal groupings or large mass groupings, they talk in a different way. And then when you get to the hierarchical groupings, they have a totally different view and totally different forms of interaction. But generally, going back to what I said initially about types of behaviors that complexity theory tries to sort out is, at the very top, things can seem very coherent, but a lot of the times they might actually arise from emergent phenomena, self-organizing systems that make you think, that make you perceive that it might be coherent, but it's not. There are different layers and levels of complexity for a phenomena, like the Taliban. But there is a great use for the viable systems model when it comes to an identifiable organization. So remember, at this level, there's many typologies, many type of groupings, everything like that. And at the very top with the orange circle and the green circle, the traditional and the Haqqani, they try to nudge it with proclamations to convince you, to make those at the very bottom believe in the ideas. And then without ever joining the Taliban on a structural level, organizational level, instead acting the way that Taliban wants them to act, nudging them for certain behaviors that then influence the middle scale and then finally the wider environment. So you could have Taliban groupings that are in the mountain. Yeah, there was a very good case in the mountains that every 6 months, one guy would come with a piece of paper of what the spiritual leader of the Taliban has said. No instructions on what to attack or what to do, but just the Islamic Emirates leadership has said X, Y, and Z, quotes from the Quran. Okay, bye. And they go off on the camel all the way back. And yet these groups will then interact and act and try and figure out what that means with their own behaviors. In those time-limited organizations that are created, it's very useful to use the viable systems model to understand what is it in their organization that allows them to be so adaptive, allows them to survive in an environment like that. And unfortunately, I can't go into it. I'm halfway through, but essentially it's that once the higher leadership tries to convince members of a group or leaders of a group they then interact with the environment in a certain way. But the fact that they can get these leaders to be able to do that, and also get them to create a certain type of organization that can interact with a fast changing environment, I started to find out very interesting things about that. For example, system ones, you could use it to understand different tribe members in a tribal leaders grouping. Because of tribal culture, they are very loosely connected. There's no official authority for these guys. Instead, they interact in a way that only prescribes to the tribal code. And all the information and decision-making that happens and all the structures that are built for that situation are based on that tribal code and what the Taliban nudges you to do. And the moment that need goes away, it falls apart. I won't get into these parts, but I will quickly skip to some of the challenges that creates for hierarchical organizations, militaries. There's a standardization of behavior that happens, decision-making, information, all under a hierarchical setting that severely limits requisite variety. Most problematic of all that I found was that it tries to prescribe the environment as being only in the way a document or a researcher in some US military lab or organization says it is. But that is severely affected by the way the Taliban work, because the Taliban leadership in a local area that gets a few tribes together for something, many of them are extremely adapted to specific environments. For example, say tribe D lives near a river with a few mountains and the socio-economic environment is in a certain way. They are very adapted to those particular circumstances. Well, what the US military done was, here is a document, these tens of thousands of different environments all across Afghanistan, doesn't matter. The different types of Taliban structures that are built in a specific time, that doesn't matter. None of it matters. This is how we should see the whole country and the whole Taliban. And it led to a lot of problems because, as previously, a lot of these guys are not in the Taliban. They just at times may work with the Taliban, other times may work with the government. It doesn't mean that they are Taliban. They just do it based on the wider dynamics. A great example of that was when I think it was the British that came into Helmand to try and build a school. It was in Nadali, I think, supposedly Taliban held area. So they built the school there. And a few days later, it was blown up. The British obviously said, oh, it's the Taliban. It's an insurgency. They've come from outside the area. In fact, it was a jealous local tribe that had asked the central Taliban leadership in another country to provide us with the explosives because he was jealous they had built that school in another tribe's territory, not his. But the British came in full force, totally flattened Nadali and said these guys were all terrorists. They're against girls' schools, they're against. In fact, in that moment, in that situation, there was a specific type of environment with two Taliban groups, two tribal groups that one went towards the Taliban. And that issue kind of generally comes back to how Army Command works throughout Western insurgency campaigns, is that the majority of them follow a chain of command that is always limited by that chain of command. In other words, a goal is given and that goal requires them to work in a certain environment. But the variety in that environment is always reduced by the very chain of command that told them to take the area. It very generally, I've skipped quite a lot of stuff, but I'll end here. It's, if you have the type of organization like the Taliban, who have a lot of small scale behaviors with all these groupings, versus a very coherent organization like the US military, where all their decision making, all their requisite right is limited by the top leadership, you get a difference between the amount of complexity or adaptability in the environment and the efficiency. The Taliban are not very efficient. They are very bad at large-scale behaviors, coherent behaviors with thousands of Taliban groups and tribes working as one. It usually falls apart. But in the small scale, their variety was not able to be matched by militaries. I'll leave it at that. Unfortunately, I've skipped quite a few things, but does anyone have any questions?
You close down the slides then so we can see the faces, Omar.
Oh,
Thank you very much. And if people want to reveal themselves, I will be horrified if there aren't some interesting questions to pop out of all that interesting stuff. I shall start with one because it just, what do you mean by the notion of organization?
oh, that's a question for me.
You, yeah.
I tried to follow what Stafford Beer would say, but also in that presentation, I used the term mostly to describe it the way defense literature would describe it. That there are identifiable information systems, that decision-making flows from the top to the bottom through different, God, I'm not explaining it properly.
No, I get it. So you're suggesting then, if I could try and interpret that, to be an organization, there must necessarily be some form of bureaucratic structure and information system that architects the organization around a set of goals that are centrally determined, as opposed to any other form of being. That's how it sounds. That's why I'm sort of kind of interpreting it that way. Which is, that then explains why you would say the Taliban is not organized or is not an organization. So I'm just so the hands are popping up. I don't know whether David or Angus got to the trigger first. I'll go with Angus. And if we've got a question, Angus, or a challenge, or whatever you want to make it. Thank you.
Well, it's a bit like yours because it's actually related to what you were just saying, John. First of all, Omar, that was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I learned various things about the situation there and reinforced other things that I knew. So that was interesting. I'm running along the same lines as John. As far as cybernetics is concerned, I didn't hear you use the word feedback. I heard quite a lot of what might be called systems dynamics or something. So I am interested in the cybernetics of this. When we talk about VSM, I do want to challenge your assumption that VSM can't be used for all of this. And I'll put the challenge, but it's then intended to be invite your response as a question. So the way I'm seeing it is that here's a situation in which there's a recursive structure. And if I put it very simple, there's a top line. The top line recursive structure is the whole lot all together. And then there's the individual tribes. And then within that, individual people. And part of the principle there is that there's a certain identity for how that works. And these tribes are ancient, so you have a very strong identity function going on. And they all belong, for example, use the word Pashtun. So there's a whole cohesion there. So there's a kind of strong identity where people feel themselves belonging to tribes. And there's a strong S2 because there's all of this cohesive factors of shared codes and so on that you were talking about. Because there's a strong S5, because there's a strong S2, and because individuals know what to do in a situation, they don't need a lot of S3. And the innovation that's going on is mostly taking place down at the S4, but then every now and then again, you see somebody comes up, some note person comes up with an idea, and then they all go away and think about that. That looks very like. So if we think of VSM not so much as a functional, structural thing that needs a boss to run it, but a way of behaving, a way of operating in the interactions between people, a way of orienting, and that the system itself is just a convenience for us to understand those dynamics, then I'm wondering why VSM isn't a very useful way of looking at it.
Good. Yeah, good point. And I tried to get to that. Some of the slides I missed
At the end, yes.
feedback. But the reason I find it difficult to try and explain organization in this topic is when you look at the central Taliban hierarchy, the picture I showed in the beginning, people have set roles, and it doesn't have to be roles how we imagine in a company, where everyone sits down and there's an official letter saying you're in this position and these are the decision makings you have to do and these go here and there. It's that exists at the central Taliban hierarchy. The problem I have is when you have a Taliban grouping and they identify with the Taliban central hierarchy, a lot of the times they are not necessarily connected to the Taliban themselves, the central hierarchy sitting there planning stuff. It's that they form a network for a moment and then dissipate back. And a lot of the times there are no, how you would say, structures that connect them to the central hierarchy. They themselves are in fact totally separate with very little interaction with the central hierarchy. But what you said there, which really reverberates with me, is they would have a code of conduct. They would have a shared, how you would say, worldview that correlates with the central Taliban leadership. And then they interact with the environment in that way. But there are no, information structures, information networks. A lot of the times there aren't. They just do their own thing in line with their tribal code and a lot of
Well,
Islamic.
feedback says feedback says that is the person capable of knowing what they ought to be doing in that given situation? And what Beer was really interested in is the autonomy of the individual. So he saw VSM as a way of giving autonomy to the individual. What you're saying is that these people got the autonomy. They had autonomy. They knew what to do. They could act. And in order to do that, there were certain things, that they got that supported them in that. And I suspect that one could be a bit more VSM could be more useful in it, but I don't want to take up any more time right now.
Thanks, Angus. It's a really good question. I love the loop back to autonomy on that one, because what was going through my head was Omar was describing that, and his answer to your question, and indeed the original work, was if I could create an organization where the set of people that believed in the same idea believed it so coherently they never needed an instruction from the center, that would be pretty well perfect.
Exactly.
Because it's the ultimate autonomous viable system. Is I'm doing what I'm doing because it's the right thing to do, and I don't need anybody to tell me to do it. It's fabulous.
Yep, exactly.
David.
Very much, Omar. Given your analysis now, what might you have advised the various involved parties before the takeover of the Taliban kind of last year? And possibly how might you advise any of them going forward? But how could your analysis have suggested inputs which might have created a different outcome, for example?
I think the main thing would be that I wanted to get to it at the end of the presentation was, yes, it would be great if they had a lot of requisite variety, Western military counterinsurgency platforms. It would have been very good because of the chaos that really is the Afghan social environment. However, one of the things I saw with the Taliban, or people that prescribe to the Taliban ideology, is that they would change the way the interacting elements would combine with each other for a certain task in a moment would always tend to be structurally different to what they were previously. If that makes sense. For example, a group would come together in Helmand on one day for a specific task of blowing up a bridge. They would propose a leader. It would become you can use the VSM to understand that. But then the next week they would have quite a different structure. They would be very rigid, very tightly controlled, which you can use the VSM to understand why it's limited. But then they would be able to do very coordinated actions, and the insurgency groups there would make it very difficult for counterinsurgency to be able to match that. so what I'm trying to say, it wasn't so much about requisite variety as much as it was that the US military would have to keep changing if they are a coherent system or if they are a very network system, because the Taliban were changing it all the time. One moment they would do large scale interactions, another moment they would do very small scale group interactions. And the US military would have to keep up with that. So I would say that, to look more into how they can quickly change their structure as fast as or faster than the insurgent they're trying to fight.
Faster. Thank you.
So if we move on to James, you had your hand up, and then Mr. Berry, I'm going to come to you to get you to ask that question out loud as well. James first.
Hi, Omar. That's really interesting. A couple of comments, I guess, is that a different angle maybe, but the Western armies talk about asymmetric warfare, and what you're dealing with in the Taliban is an asymmetric system, and they do asymmetric warfare. And you're obviously absolutely on the money in that the structure that the Western armies work under reduces requisite variety by its very structure and by the way the command and control works. So they can never match the variety of an asymmetric structure or an asymmetric system, which is kind of what it is, where it works under different conditions of opportunity, values, alignment within a particular context. And it's those values that kind of gel people together in that moment, which is like the emergence of the asymmetric nature of what they do. And it is chaotic in both senses of the word, in that because it lacks structure and lacks the ability to be defined in how it operates. So I'm not very good on beer, but definitely under requisite variety, it cannot be matched. The only way in which the Western armies could meet the Taliban, as it were, or any other similar organization, of which there are quite a few, is by being able to suppress the amount of variety that the Taliban can express, basically. So it's to constrain their behavior within a set of guidelines, which in that type of environment is pretty impossible. So on a variety basis, that's hopefully that kind of helps, but that's the sort of angle that I've looked at it, not the Taliban, but the British Army in those kind of perspectives. So they can't cope with it. They literally cannot cope with it.
So Mr. Berry, if you'd like to come in with your question, and then I'll come to, I don't know if it's going to be Peter or Freya, but one of the Dudleys is going to follow you up. So set them up for a fall, if you would, Rich.
I wouldn't dare do that, John. Thank you. Omar, thank you. Brilliant input. You know my views on your work. I think it's really insightful. My thinking here, just listening, is what are your thoughts about the Taliban being essentially a dynamic network or networks of black boxes? You can kind of see stuff that goes in, you can see stuff that comes out, but you haven't really got a clue. And maybe you shouldn't focus on mapping what goes on in the middle because it is just too complex, perhaps. I think Beer uses the term esoteric boxes, and I think that's the same kind of thing as an attribute black box, but people may correct me on that. And I suppose my question is, how might that thinking help in your assessment or not?
It does connect to me with what James Bryant said as well. It comes to a point where it's very difficult to try and map it out, like you said. It's never actually been achieved. Yeah. All I did was say these are just the elements flying around. Sometimes they're like a very coherent organization, sometimes they're not. But it certainly is like a black box. If we were to try and understand, go there and understand a specific area, geographic area, the amount of variety at the moment, tomorrow, day after, it would be simply impossible. It'd be simply impossible.
Stafford described some systems as being indescribably complex. And
Yes.
human interactions probably in many senses probably falling into that category, and human interactions between multiple individuals, even with a shared objective or a common desired outcome, will probably be indescribably complex. And then you have to ask the question, why would you want to bother?
Yes.
Yeah. Would knowing more about how the interactions are working actually benefit you in terms of the nudging or management or leadership or whatever it is you want to describe the behavior that's driving it? Peter, or sorry, I should say Dr. Dudley or Miss Dudley, who are we getting?
The doctor.
Yes. Okay, so let's start. I mean, for all these things are indescribably complex, their complexity seems to be quite adequately described as indescribable. So we'll sort of start at that point. Where am I at with this? David Kilcullen wrote about Taliban Afghan hill tribes, writes remarkably well about it, and echoes if a lot of what you were saying, Omar. So I'm there with that, and his approach to the idea that actually the right thing to do is what we think is right, and therefore we'll get on with it, and the rest of you can go boil your heads while we're doing it, kind of thing, which sort of partly talks to the dynamic of interaction between various tribes and various power spaces, and partly talks to what James Bryant was saying about the difficulty of asymmetric conflict, shall we call it, because they're the ability to change shape just as we posture ourselves to deal with the shape we think we're facing is absolutely perfect, because it leaves us scratching our knackers and falling over our feet trying to figure out what just happened to us. So I think there's that side. I think the challenge about organization and not being able to talk about organization, and there's an idea going on in my head about something that I would tend to call intelligent transience. So rather than having the notion of fixed organization to be intelligent, the intelligence lies in the ability to change and possibly change the identity that we use to measure the value we're trying to create. And that really shifts all this more to autopoiesis than it does to adaptation. We sort of recreate ourselves almost the same, but slightly different to better fit our environment. So I think that's roughly my view on it. That said, I did enjoy it. It was good and well worth the wait, Omar. Thank you.
Anybody else? There's a few people haven't said anything. Miguel, you were talking about DARPA just now, the chat.
Yeah. Although I profess a great deal of ignorance about VSM, so I can't address it from that perspective. But what's always attracted me about DARPA is they really seem to throw the military project model out the window, and they've been highly successful. That's also odd for the U.S. military. And they work on a 12-month time cycle, and they seem to have gotten this really good relationship between the Pentagon and DARPA, where the Pentagon really supports them in a very generous way because of the work that they produce. Now, the time cycles that DARPA works on are 12 months. So by no means do I mean do I infer that this would be the solution to deal with tribal maneuvering, because the time cycle with tribes, I assume, is days, weeks, dramatically faster. Just a thought that there are probably organizations that are much faster out there within the military.
Thanks, Miguel. I think I'm minded that some years ago I was invited to an event called the Energy Infrastructure Summit at the Royal Society, and it was fascinating. And all these people were saying, what's going to happen when all the lights fail and all that sort of stuff. And I just remember this American general standing up towards the end, and he said, well, we've got the solution here. And this is the playbook of all possible things that could ever possibly happen in a war. And as long as everybody follows the orders, it'll be terrific. And you point out to him that all the people in the center are going to be dead, because the first thing you'll do is take out central command, and then your whole system will collapse. And where's the playbook for no central command? And they couldn't. And actually, as going back to Peter's thread, the notion that organization emerges from the interaction of individuals. We collect together to make certain things happen. Within certain Western history, we created these peculiar centralized religions, and we've created centralized organizations that all assume some sort of command and control structure, which we know to be bonkers in a guerrilla environment. And certainly for the UK, we spent from 1960, whatever it was, to 1998, fighting a guerrilla war in Northern Ireland, which other people have far more experience than I. But terrorists don't organize themselves around a central command and control structure, because then if you catch one, you catch them all, and we never managed to do that. So they must be behaving in a way which is not dissimilar to the actions that Omar is describing in Afghanistan. And Vanilla talked in the chat about the Gilets jaunes, and of course I think the way we spell guerrilla would be a French spelling, I think, Vanilla. So it ties back together very nicely. Okay, anybody else want to come in on Omar's piece? Omar, I assume you're happy for us to record. Well, we have recorded it. I hope everybody realized that, and share it with those who weren't able to join us today. James, you've got your hand up again. Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, no. Just one thing that springs to mind is it also sounds very comparative with the way in which crowds and mobs behave. In as much as in a large crowd of people, if you have a demonstration, you have a whole bunch of people from different backgrounds with different allegiances and in different groups, all come together to parade up a street and protest. And in amongst those, people will interact and collide, and small groups will form, and things will happen. It could be bricks, it could be songs, it could be anything. But they're totally emergent based on alignments of values and location and opportunity. And it sounds like there's some dynamic. I've never looked at the dynamics of those kind of things, but there's a similar kind of dynamic happening, but on in a different sort of context.
And sometimes in a people environment, the person with the biggest stick, the loudest voice, the broadest shoulders, or the greatest wealth emerges as a leader. Strange that, isn't it? That sort of individual power can both create the tribing, wanted a better way of describing it, but also then this notion of, we'll call it leadership, emerges. David, your hands up.
Yes, just coming back to the fighting day to day, being flexible day to day. We're not very good at that. I'm interested in the Pashtunwali code, the kind of marching orders, the DNA of a particular group. And I suppose if I were trying to influence things, I would be trying to develop that code. All religions, all belief systems evolve, whether they acknowledge it or not. And I'm just wondering how that code, whether it's good enough and autonomous by itself, or self-creating, locked in, or there are ways in which that code might be added to or subtracted from or complexified, which would avoid the messy business of people killing people when you can change their minds given enough time.
The codes, well, they call it a code, but it's more in a sense of, these are the things you should think about. If someone takes your honor away, you better get your, but the way you can interpret that or then apply it to the environment can be very different. It could be very different between two people in the same tribe, two different tribes. It really depends. So say if David said a really bad word to me and I'm like, okay, I could either ask you for apology or I can go off, make a small network to come and beat you up. It really depends. There's no
but doesn't that come back then, Omar, to the shared identity question that says, it might be that at some point I choose to ignore you, so I snub you. It might be in certain places I choose to spray you with tar and cover you in feathers, and in other parts of the world I might shoot your kneecaps off. In others I'll stick an IED under your vehicle and kill you. They're all similar and not unreasonable responses to being unsalted, and depending on our perspectives on what we might call civilization, those are the responses that are available. And frankly, there's no playbook to choose between them, I don't think. I've got Richard Berry, you got your hand up, and then Angus. Richard.
Thanks, John. I've just put a question in the sideline there about the use of games theory, and I just wanted to kind of pick up on the points made earlier about asymmetry in this situation, and your American playbook, John. I think your American general with his playbook or her playbook. It's this idea in Western cultures that we try to codify things. We try to codify systems, codify behaviors, and therefore create predictable responses. And what I like about the examples that Omar has given is prediction is absolute, and inference from data is actually a huge challenge. And I think Afghanistan, Iraq, AQI is the other example where predictability just is defeated. The playbook is defeated. So when you look at games theory, my limited understanding is that it's based on sort of Nash von Neumann's sort of theories, and it's starting from the idea of symmetry. So a game of chess, there are equal players. We'd never reach a Nash equilibrium, I presume, if you've got different players in different dynamics. And I'm just wondering what people think, and indeed Omar thinks, about games theory as a way of approaching strategy in order to deal with these kinds of situations.
I think it has a lot of use value. In that environment I described, there are hierarchical organizations, networked organizations that survive for a day or for a year, but their interactions with each other for resources, prestige, whatever it might be. I think game theory has a lot of potential right there on how these different groupings interact with each other.
Okay, I'm going to intervene. So I think, Angus, you had your hand up, and then we're back to either Peter or Fred, depending who gets the microphone first, I guess.
Game theory has many levels at which it's played.
Angus, you're on mute, old chap.
Well, I was pressing the space bar, which usually lets you speak, so sorry about that. Thanks, John. I would rather suggest that we abandon the idea that this group is chaotic. If they were chaotic, they would have lost the war years ago. They're not chaotic. It's what happens is that people looking at them can't understand what's going on. And there's a vast difference between the observer not understanding, they can't see the pattern, and the people inside it. I think an awful lot of people going into a Christian church on a Sunday, who've never been before, have no idea what goes on, and they go into it, have no idea what's going on. A lot of other people go in and they have no problem dealing. They could go into a new church anywhere in the country, walk in and participate and manage and figure out what's happening. Now, given that what we see is that this is a very functional group, it's clear, functional meaning they're efficacious, they're achieving something, they're dynamic, they're powerful, they're winning. Okay, in that case, they understand what's going on. They're reading the runes and they know what's happening, and they understand the opponents, and the opponents don't understand them. It's the same sort of thing happens sometimes in a tennis match between top players. So I think that what would be most useful in understanding this is to abandon that notion and from there start and say, okay, so what is really going on? If it's absolutely clear to this group what is happening and they're functional and we don't understand, then we have to change our mindset. And it's the fact that we don't have the right mindset, we being a generic term here, that leads to the problem of keeps you keep losing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Angus. I like that. Freya.
There we go. Okay, so it's just a comment really that what I'm getting from this is that it just demonstrates the importance of identity, because the reason the Taliban or any insurgent group can work as like a black box network is that it doesn't actually matter what happens in the middle. They have this idea and that's what's spread around, and it's like a shared goal or aim. So that means that you actually can't intercept it, you can't intervene. If they said attack this place on this date with these people, if you manage to intercept that message, either by breaking the Enigma code or doing whatever, it's relatively easy to thwart the mission. But we all know you can't kill an idea. So if they're just sending out, I don't want to say instructions because it might give you the wrong idea, but if they're just saying Islam needs to rule the world, then it's kind of up to interpretation how that happens. So it gives the smaller groups or the people lower down an opportunity to do it as they please, and they're just working towards that shared goal together. So if ever there was an advert for identity being important in an organisation, I'd say the Taliban are it.
Could I come back to both of that, John? I think he's frozen.
You're frozen, Omar.
Oh, I was frozen. I'll come back to what Angus said, but what you say, Freya, is exactly it. There's the Islam that binds them, the tribal codes that create the parameter of how they should do things they believe in. But that kind of connects to what Angus, what you said. The US government spent $2 billion trying to do what you just said. The problem is that the Taliban has a hierarchical organization that I showed in the beginning. However, the millions of supporters are not in that specific organization. It's the interactions between everything going on, whether the guy's Taliban or not, whether that's a government guy or not, different groups, international NGOs, Russian, Chinese influence, all of that kind of shape the dynamics in which all these guys interact in. And sometimes a group is following the Taliban for whatever reason, and there can be hundreds of reasons, and sometimes they're not. And you see that today with the Taliban fragmenting into supposedly what the US is saying now, 40 different groups. The moment their goal was finished, they're starting to fall apart, which kind of shows the limitations of thinking about just identity. Because there's always an adaptability efficiency trade-off. There's also a trade-off with how much large-scale behaviors you can do, like run a government or a society, versus how adaptable you want to be, which means you probably can't run large-scale behaviors by being small-scale, i.e. adaptive. And trying to understand, so one point I should have made clear, I did skip through a lot of it, was the Taliban themselves don't actually have this supposed very functional group that understands. None of them actually understand whether the tribes, the different Taliban groups, actually understand what's going on. A lot of them end up dying. I've heard that 97% of the leadership over the last 20 years has died. Those specific groups don't know what's going on when they do a certain action. They only have that immediate information. We shouldn't imagine it like it's Britain or France. These guys are in the mountains. 70% of the population is rural. Most people don't have phones. So it's not like they can be very well informed and figure out. They only know their immediate locality and act accordingly. And from there, those interactions.
There's an argument there, Omar, that in a given location, the natural geography lends itself towards a naturally local form of organization. Yeah. And it's only sort of Western illusions of nation states that drives us towards this sort of determination that we must have central control of stuff. So if we actually left Afghanistan alone and said to the folks that run it, run it your own way, we're not interfering anymore, and they were all humble enough to kind of go, I'm going to leave Charlie and Fred the other side of the mountain alone, and they can run their lives the way they want to, as long as they don't interfere in mine, then they wouldn't be falling apart. They'd be running something very, very coherently that we wouldn't recognize as a nation state because it doesn't reflect our prejudices, but that wouldn't mean they wouldn't be educated, go to school, whatever it is they want to do, that fits their particular take on their particular life.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
so there's something really interesting for me about the way, if you like, the Western lens through which we interpret a lot of this stuff, that's informed by our peculiar histories and the emergence of central command and control hierarchies. Any final comment from you, Omar? I've been fascinating discussion, really good presentation, lots of good challenges going in there. So I'm really, really happy you did that for us. So we'll do the clapping. Do you want to close it off with anything, or are you happy?
No, I think that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you
Thanks,
very
guys.
much. So do the clapping thing to finish that off. Really, really interesting. We'll have to send you some more books to read and challenge your understanding of VSM as well, I think, and push it out there. I remember sitting in a car in Malaysia and being told it's not an organization, it's a way of thinking, and that was sort of, you know, interesting. Okay, so we said, or I said, because apparently I have the talking stick at the moment, that the second half of this we would try and talk about and understand how people came to think of cybernetics, and I called it Discovering Cybernetics, and I invited 3 people, one of whom is still in the room. So we're going to wander around a little bit for the next sort of 40 minutes or so, because I'm interested in our different interpretations and understandings of this thing that we all call it cybernetics, and most of us have no idea what anybody else means when they're in the same room. So very reflective of your chaotic tribes, I think, Omar. And James, you were daft enough to not run away when I invited you to do this. So would you care to lead us off?
Yeah, apparently I discovered cybernetics about 2002, but was unconsciously aware, or not consciously aware of having discovered it. Because I was looking back through some notes of mine the other day, and I did a course on neurolinguistic programming, and one of the presuppositions of neurolinguistic programming, and I got the thing in front of me, says the system, in brackets person, with the most flexibility, in brackets choices of behavior, will have the most influence on the system. This is the law of requisite variety, which of course we know it isn't, but that was that was how it was presented. So being unconscious of having been presented with at least some sort of entry point potentially into cybernetics, I then stumbled across it about 3 years ago when I was writing some stuff on behaviors, and came across the law of requisite variety in terms of Ashby and variety, only variety can destroy variety. And at the time was kind of using it as they say about the drunk leaning on the lamppost, more for support than illumination. In sort of writing and investigating what I was messing with, I eventually went and started to read Ashby, and then got quite excited as I became well, more liked, and still some support, thankfully. But yeah, that was my entry point into it, because I was trying to understand a whole bunch of work I've been doing in behaviors, and why some of the stuff that I'd done had worked, which was inadequately explained by behavioral science. So that led me to start reading more and more about Ashby, and I'm very much a proponent of Ashby and requisite variety, and for ill or otherwise, see behavioral cybernetics as a battle between control and disturbance, and that's really the lens that I've been using for the last couple of years, and using cybernetics and the things that have for me emerged out of looking at the world through that lens, to address all sorts of things, from what I do to how I develop businesses and develop consultancy and so forth. And so I look at everything through that lens, and probably to my shame, John, I've read an awful lot of other things, many of which haven't really taken in my head from the cybernetics, including VSM, and I sort of fall back on the fundamental, what I think of as a fundamentalist approach of displacement and control, which I've been pulling apart for quite a bit of time. So when people ask me what is cybernetics, I kind of go back to the explanation of the helmsman on the boat and trying to navigate from one place to another, and how the helmsman and all the various other bits of the boat are counteracting all the forces that are trying to take them off course, or in some case help them get to where they're going. And I tend to explain cybernetics in that way, as that's pretty much what it means for me. So I don't know if that's what you wanted, but that's what you got.
I wanted whatever it was you wanted to say.
Well, that's brilliant. It's perfect.
I'm very happy. So you use the expression behavioral cybernetics. Would you care to explain to the throng what you mean? Because it's a qualifying word on your cybernetics.
Yeah, sure. So there's behavioral science and then there's cybernetics, and the twain haven't really met very much. The whole sort of canon of behavioral science touches every now and again on cybernetics, but not very much. To go to sort of touch on Omar's thing a little bit, I've got a book on my shelf which is it Gareth Morgan's Images of Organization, which talks about lots of different organizational structures, and in there you'll find requisite variety and cybernetics. So it touches on it a little bit, but it doesn't really get into the meat of cybernetics and apply it to behaviors. And
so I'm sitting here thinking, because I do that from time to time, and there's a quote at the beginning of my PhD, and I think it's Ashby, but it might have been Wiener, and I just can't quite recall at the moment, and I'm not going to get my PhD out to look it up, which says cybernetics is not about things, but about ways of behaving.
Yes, it does, but it doesn't really dig into the depths and the guts of the thing. In my humble opinion, as it were, or not so humble opinion, there's a lot of things that are covered inside, that are touched on in cybernetics, but aren't actually pulled apart. And I guess my counter to that would be how many people trying to change behaviors in organizations or anywhere are utilizing cybernetics to do it versus using behavioral science with no nod or view of cybernetics. And the behavioral cybernetics thing is cybernetics has explained why a bunch of the things that I was doing by intuition or whatever in big organizations with my colleagues worked in a more elegant manner than and why some things didn't work in a more elegant manner than the theories that are in behavioral science. They're both applicable, but cybernetics provides, if you like, a numerical science, a process by which those things can be pulled apart and better understood, in my view.
I'm listening again. You just used the word numerical, which entertains and amuses, but do explain.
Well, it provides some what should we say, credible science to behavioral science. Is very much a research and test and view, and it's very subjective. It can be considered to be very subjective. Ashby's theories and approaches are all based on numbers, calculations, mathematics.
Is that because that was the tool he had available to him, because that was his background?
Well,
or is it necessary to the cybernetics?
Well, we know he was a psychiatrist.
Yeah, but he used, he was his things are stuffed full of maths, So it's not just I've got an idea, but I've got a set of matrices and operations that can kind of support it and prove it. So I think it adds a level of credibility that some of the behavioral science stuff doesn't have. I mean, one of the people I'm really interested in on a behavioral science basis, a couple of the people are Milgram and Zimbardo. And Milgram and Zimbardo's stuff is very, very illuminating, but highly contentious. because people turn around and say, well, they weren't doing proper research, for example. So the outcomes that they, or the theories that emerged from the work that they were doing is very much discredited by behavioral scientists generally, but actually prove, if you take the theories, they actually prove very effective if you deploy them inside organizations.
So I'm not familiar with the body of work. Could you say a little bit more?
Yeah, well, Milgram's the guy that did what I sort of generally term the electrocution experiments. He's the guy that got members of the public to turn dials up in an experiment that was supposedly giving increasing levels of electric shock to subjects that they couldn't see, and the subjects screamed louder and louder as they were turned the dials further and further. And the control mechanism was a guy in a white coat with a clipboard. When they said, do you think we should continue? He said, yes, please continue, in different varieties of way in the experiment. And Milgram was specifically trying to understand why ordinary people do terrible things on the back of what happened in the Holocaust. He came up with one of his sort of lines is that people aren't so much sort of the values that they believe they are as the content. So, sorry, people don't behave in the way that their values play through so much as they behave to the context that they find themselves in. So in other words, we're contextual animals, to Omar's presentation, really. We behave in response to the context that we find ourselves in. And if our values are compromised versus the context, we tend to compromise our values rather than submit to the context. So it's very much control and displacement in, from a cybernetic perspective, one can interpret it as anyway.
Is it not context within a certain framework of values? And you can change the framework. I mean, not everybody complied in the way that some of the people complied. And if you look at why they didn't, there are value system things in there. If you look at the difficulty in repeating Ash's experiments nowadays, when people know about the inference, this is the trouble with social science. Once you sort of reflect on it, it changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think they got maximum compliance of something like 93% by changing various aspects, which is what Milgram was looking at, is how do you get people to comply? And you could look at it as nudging,
Or how do you get, more than 7% not complying, which I'm working on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a harder thing, but it's all, basically the thing is it's responding to context. And yeah, there was an exciting program that was done by Darren Brown some time ago, where he basically repeated the experiment. I got the same kind of results.
And he was a conjurer, but I love Darren Brown. Yeah.
In many ways, not dissimilar to the bank wiring room experiments by Hawthorne in the 30s.
Yeah,
it wasn't electrocuting people, but if I pay you more attention, do you behave differently? If I ignore you, do you behave? And so there's if we apply a different stimulus, do we get a different outcome? And so you sort of have to wonder. Much of the cybernetics I do doesn't have numbers in it, which is just as well, because I'm not very good with them, as Peter will no doubt tell you. I can't even do dates today, so I'm really struggling. But the understanding, if you like, of what is happening is a stimulus response adapt type of loop going on, which sometimes we might want to count it, but sometimes we just need to observe it happening. And we can't get inside the black box to discover why, and actually there's no value in doing so. So when we're talking about organizations don't behave, people in organizations behave. So in one sense, at that level, organizations or cybernetic systems are just about the way people behave inside them.
Yeah, I mean, an organization is a context, and the context tends to limit how people behave.
But don't the people create the context of the organisation for themselves? Aren't we doing that right now?
Well, okay. Well, we can sort of argue which one creates the other, but if in the beginning, the individuals tend to create the organization, but when people join an organization of a certain mass, they tend to comply to the norms, and they norm, you know, that all that research, they norm to the organization. So you get to a certain observation, and research seems to show that when you get to a certain size, people coming in with all sorts of intents then tend to norm to the values of the organization, because otherwise the organization expels them. And it's the same with tribes, you know, tribal values. And so you can look at it all sorts of levels of hierarchy, that you have to do certain behaviors to belong. And if you don't do those behaviors, then you tend not to belong for very long.
I think this is very important things to hold in awareness in all situations. Nevertheless, as someone who got a third-class degree in psychology, I do think sometimes psychology trumps sociology, and the emphasis on organisation rather than how you sort of leverage on individuals and so on, and how we mentioned identity before, and identity, one can have multiple identities which arguably may be brought into existence in certain situations, but it is an interaction. The whole notion of identity, the identity of identity, how sort of crystallized one sees that, also plays into it. I would of course refer you to Emerson. If the red slayer thinks he slays, or if the slain thinks he is slain, they know that when the subtle ways I keep and pass and turn again. I mean, Omar knows very well the stuff about, it's very hard to tell who has won in the short and medium and arguably long term.
I didn't get that.
Angus, you have your hand up.
I need that reference.
Yes, thank you, John, and everybody. So a slightly provocative question. Why are we talking such a lot about sociology and psychology? If cybernetics is a meta-discipline that interacts with just about anything, physics, psychology,
yep,
then certainly we could talk about any of these things, and they might all be relevant at some level. But the interesting thing is, what does cybernetics do to change what the people who are in psychology or sociology or anything else think about the world? And in the past, cybernetics transformed what many biologists thought about the world. It transformed what many psychologists thought about the world, and so on, sociologists. So the question I'm asking is, where does the cybernetics of this come in?
Well, for me, if that's aimed at me,
Anyone.
It's given me a different lens on the world, to look at behaviors, and at my core, I believe behaviors are, and this is probably going to be contentious, but behaviors are the only thing, right? Everything does behavior, and it can't stop doing behavior, whether it's a rock or a person. And because cybernetics is a behavioral science, therefore everything's doing cybernetics all the time. And therefore, if you understand, or your understanding of cybernetics is a fundamental understanding of the world around us, whether it's Newton or Heisenberg or Emerson or whoever, it provides a key by which you can look at the world. It's not the only key, I'm sure, but a fundamental way of looking at the world and understanding things. And I understand
that. I don't have a problem with behavior. The question is, what is there? So, for example, in cybernetics, somebody's eye goes somewhere, and because their eye goes somewhere, they see something, and it's the way it should be or it shouldn't be. So and it doesn't go somewhere else. So the behavior of the eye, right down to that level of detail, what is the eye doing? That's a behavioral response to something. But the question is, what does cybernetics tell us about how that eye behavior works? I think perceptual control theory, for example, is incredibly helpful in looking at the whole sort of psychology of behavior. So I'm interested in how specifically do you see cybernetics transforming behavioral science?
Because what cybernetics, for me, again, cybernetics is about control and displacement. So behavior is a response, all behavior, in my view, is a response to displacement, and all behavior creates a displacement. So it's a domino effect of displacement and control. And control is not just control as in stopping displacement from happening, it's actually utilization of displacement in the way that enables the goal to be achieved, because it's all goal related.
So displacement in this sense can be related to negative feedback and the goal, you know, so positive and negative feedback. Is that, am I understanding right?
So I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the question. What?
When you talk about displacement, you're relating it, you could relate it to positive and negative feedback. Negative feedback indicating that there is a displacement from how things ought to be, goal orientation. When you get positive feedback, you can see that you're on goal.
Well, there's always a feedback loop.
Yeah.
So, and that's...
So catching a ball, for example, involves a process of adjustment, and you don't want your hand to be in the wrong place, which would be a displacement when the ball arrives, like the English cricketer who dropped the cap.
Yeah, if the goal is to catch the ball, when you learn to catch the ball, then you're making all sorts of adjustments. And when you actually are in the instant when a ball comes towards you, then you respond in such a way that you catch the ball. If you miss it, you end up giving yourself a whole bunch of feedback, and probably from the crowd as well, by the sound of things.
But the ball itself is giving you feedback in its traveling.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Everything's giving you feedback.
Great, thank you.
Brilliant. David, you were next, and then Mr. Berry.
Well, I think Angus is right. We've been covering a small domain today and cybernetics should have a wider overview. On the other hand, the small domain of sociology and psychology, like education, is something which everybody is convinced they know about in the way that they wouldn't claim for engineering or whatever. So it can be a useful example. But I did want to sort of bridle a bit. Anything called a science isn't really, has been said before now. Behavioral science based on behaviorism. Yeah, if you starve a rat for 3 days and then get it to follow a certain reinforcement schedule by the way you reward it when it does certain strange behaviors, does tell you a certain amount. When you come to have a rat live with you and you want to evict it, you will see it manifests a vastly wider range of intelligent behavior than was ever covered in my degree. And I think the attempt to reduce things to a behaviorist perspective is tremendously valuable. I mean, we all use it to some degree in our interactions with other people, but we do need to import our higher level reflections on our own reflections and so on, which evolve out of for example, a behaviorist perspective. Or incidentally, there's a very good, Angus talking about eye movements, eye tracking. There's a good article recently in Royal Society Proceedings about eye tracking, of which one Richard Dewhurst is a co-author.
David, if I be so bold, I think you might be conflating two different things there. One is research methodology, which looks to do things and have them repeated to prove that there's some stimulus and response type of approach, and the other is behavior, of which what a rat does under one circumstance and what it does under another circumstance is its behavior. Its behavior under every circumstance, or any circumstance, is a response to the context within which it finds itself. So, and we know they're very ingenious little beasties. So there is a limitation of science because it can only, it can't create the whole by dissecting it into small bits and then trying to stick them all together again.
Yeah. I mean, most of us avoid martyrdom, but not everybody, and that makes a difference.
Sure. But as I was saying, though, I don't think behaviour is a is a tiny thing. I think it pervades everything. So it's
Yeah.
actually a very big subject. We've just, if you look at it in terms of humans, then it becomes sociology and psychology. But if you look at it in terms of particles, then it becomes, you know, physics and
sure.
so on and so forth. So, but that's how I discovered behavior. That's how I discovered cybernetics. It looks like John's left us having. Oh no, he's still here.
I'd really like to add to what you just said, but James, but as a more general question to everyone, with the problem I was having with my research on the Taliban, how can we use cybernetics, viable systems model, to understand a very complex thing going out in the environment happening, whatever that might be? And for my case, it was the Taliban, where one part of it is very visibly an organization, but many other parts and interacting stuff isn't. And what would the skills and theories and etc. be needed to enrich cybernetics, or how to think differently about cybernetics in order to understand such things? So very complex things, very dissipated things going on, and how they all relate to each other. And that's the difficulty I'm finding in my educational process.
So I'll have a conversation with you about it. From what my limited knowledge on this sort of subject area, it is that you can look at when you get these sort of complex, random, chaotic, whatever you want to call them, systems, there are patterns. You know, chaos theory does have patterns to it. But understanding the dynamics that cause the pattern to occur is where we kind of run into problems of predicting when that thing, when that shape, when that pattern will emerge. If you gather enough data of the conditions, you might find some similarity. So you might find, you know, when it's 45 degrees and the wind's blowing from the west and, you know, et cetera, then you get a similar response amongst different people, and then an event occurs. And those, what I've just mentioned, are non-trivial things, because those are things that do have a effect on how people behave, temperature and so on and so forth. So, but you have to collect a massive amount of data. And when you've got a widely distributed system and a massive amount of variety, collecting that data to then be able to do some kind of behavioral prediction is very, very difficult, very, very complex. And in those situations, like with the Taliban, they don't have the benefit or disbenefit of having all the observational systems that, for example, we have in the West. You know, tracking you on your mobile phone, watching you while you walk down the road on a camera and so on. So here, we can be stimulated to do all sorts of things, and our behavior can be controlled in all sorts of ways, small nudges and so on. But in those kind of situations, you really are stuffed, would be my technical term. And it's a system you can't control. I mean, unless you literally, you know, control, unless we did things that we definitely wouldn't do in terms of restricting human behaviors in a tyrannical kind of way, or bombing people out of existence, the system is too flexible, in my view, to be able to be influenced. I mean, we shouldn't be there, you know, is the kind of the long and the short, really, because we don't have the ability to control it. No one that's ever gone through Afghanistan has ever come out unmolested, shall we say, or on top. So
Alexander the Great did.
Did he?
Yeah.
Did he conquer Afghanistan?
Considered to be a god, he did such a wonderful job.
Yeah.
Well, he had to marry the princess of the place in order to appease the local tribes there, the Sogdians.
We should have sent Boris.
A smart strategy. That's how things work then.
But did they, I mean, did he suppress them, if you like, Angus? Because I don't know how long he was there for his relatively short life.
They didn't think in terms of suppressing. What they thought in terms of was organizing in such a way that this state became part of the overall organization, to put it like that. So they might, for example, have to pay some tribute or something like that, but it wasn't it was organized by making sure that the local rulers carried on ruling, or that there were local rulers who ruled, but they ruled in such a way that it complied with the overall aims. And part of those overall aims is that's a healthy thing, and it's not opposed to the Greeks, or
the Romans,
version of the Greeks, and so on. Yeah, the Romans had a much more, also tried to do that. They suppressed more, but anyway, that's taking us off.
Apologies all for dropping in and out. I hope my absence has demonstrated the absence of a need for centralized leadership. I have no idea where you went while I was gone, so do
all over the place.
Well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? The theme of discovering cybernetics is because when I sort of look around this virtual room, just about everybody started in a different place. And yet we've all come to some level of understanding of this stuff, and I stress some level, and I stress this stuff because defining the boundaries around it all is quite hard. Does anybody else want to tell us how they discovered it? I mean, sort of given James quite a hard time for half an hour. Anybody else want to sort of comment on that?
It's gone dead.
Oh, it's frozen.
Yeah.
May come back.
I have to say there's quite a bit about the Zoom system that
It might be easier on a computer screen to see more.
I'm sure, because there's a lot of little upstatements in this, and I've never attended a Zoom. I've done all the Zooms with Pilates.
That's Microsoft Teams.
But this,
That's Microsoft Teams.
that's what I'm familiar. That's all I'm familiar with. So, and the leader lets you in or mutes you accordingly. But
Nina, I don't know if you know that you're talking to us all. Did you want to talk to us all?
No, I was just actually interested. Am I still visible?
No, but we can hear you.
Ah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I was just struggling because the Zoom system had changed. Somebody phoned me in, and in fact, John Beckford did actually enable me to be seen. So I was just querying the Zoom system. So I'm so sorry, but I would like to say that I really, really enjoyed Omar's discussion. And so I would just like to say thank you. Not much else really at this stage, because I'm still very new to cybernetics, and I've got a large learning curve ahead, I think.
Well, we meet more or less every month, Edwina. We'll be back again on, I think it's the 12th of October, but no doubt Vanilla will keep you informed and tell you what's going on. And next month we are talking about the church as organisation. So we'll have a really interesting comparison, because the speaker is, thanks Angus, see you soon. The next speaker is, I should say that the Reverend Dr. Keith Elford. Some of you have met Keith before. Since we last met him, he has been doctored, and his doctorate is all about the Church of England as an organisation.
Interesting.
So that's a conversation that he and I started 7 or 8 years ago. With an exploration, because it has some of the same challenges and characteristics that Omar has described. A local parish, bizarrely, is a tribe. Once the tribal chief, the vicar, has been appointed, it's very, very difficult to unappoint them, very difficult for the bishop to get rid. So, and then the vicar effectively runs the parish in his or her own image, as far as they can get away with it, until the sort of the canonical law of the church kicks in and stops them out of order. So that's quite fun, because although there's this notion of the Archbishop of Canterbury and now King Charles as the sort of the head of the church, vicars pretty much do what they like, much like tribal chiefs, within a broad interpretation of something that's called sort of Anglicanism-ish. The same applies with the Catholic Church, interestingly. So I think it'd be really interesting to sort of bounce back to this conversation next month, Omar, and look at the sort of the guerrilla tactics of the local parish priest. David, your
Do
slide.
you publish?
Officially.
Do you publish the full talk? I mean, Omar had to skip quite a lot because he had a restricted time. But do you actually publish? Is it possible to access the full discussion with all the diagrams?
Everything is recorded, so we will put on YouTube in the next few days a recording of the session. If Omar wishes to share the full set of slides with you, that's it's his IP and that's his choice to do so. We just publish the bit that we've recorded. But Omar, if you're willing, I'm sure that the other people.
I'd be really interested to see the whole discussion if he is willing to do that, or whether or not he's got a forum of his own. But it would be interesting to follow through a lot of the things that he had to skip just to get a better understanding.
I'll be able to send the whole presentation to you, and hopefully it will
fantastic.
clarify a lot of the things I was trying to say instead of going.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that would be really, really great.
Just I'll send you a message on the chat here with my email. Yeah.
Okay, great.
So the vicar can only dress in the way that the church warden says he or she can, allegedly. So it's, broadly the vicar looks like they're at the top. A lot of the time they are, but not necessarily always.
You'll have detected by now that I seem to be having terrible trouble at my end tonight. I've switched connections, but it keeps freezing, so I'm not quite sure what's going on. So apologies for that.
My email is Omar KH. I can't see it. Damn.
Your Omar dot.
What? I didn't see it. It's gone. What is your email, Omar?
It should be in the chat. I sent you it on. Is it not there? Can you not see it anymore?
It flashed up on the screen, but what is it? Omar H.
It should. There should be a button on the bottom saying chat. Can you?
No, not on mine.
Okay.
Just a reminder, like if it's recorded and will be on YouTube, maybe it's not the best idea to just publicly say.
Yes, absolutely. Well done. Yes.
So, John, I wonder whether. I mean, I find utility from the way that, I've been talking about and looking at cybernetics and how I use it. I wonder whether it might be interesting to find out what other people use cybernetics for, what utility they draw from it. Staying
alive, I think, James, is sort of kind of number one for me.
Staying alive.
Remaining as maintaining my identity and remaining a viable system is kind of, the cybernetics is key. So for me, balancing the inputs and outputs of energy across the various activities that I choose to engage in that define me as me. The cybernetics is really useful in understanding, for example, when I'm stressing certain things and not stressing certain others, and sort of balancing that up. So in my head, as a set of organizing principles, thinking in terms of myself as a viable entity, it's actually quite useful. So if I eat too much and get too fat, I'm too slow and I can't move around. If I don't work hard enough, I don't earn enough money, so I can't pay the pension contributions, etc. There's a sort of utility in that respect, and then applying it for me to client situations. I mean, Peter and I are working very closely with Richard's employers. Where's Richard By? I think he's gone now. Oh, you're there, Richard, I can see you. We're working very closely with Network Rail, developing a cybernetic model which is about predicting and preventing failure. And it's a very inhuman model at this point. It's all about numbers and trains and timetables and stuff. But there's a higher order cybernetic conversation with the client group about how do we use this information, how do we need to adapt the organization to the information that's now being provided. So you've got all that sort of stuff going on. And of course, adding to that, as a father and grandfather, you're looking at how do you raise children, how do you raise grandchildren, how do you use information in a cybernetic manner to damp the things you don't want to see and amplify the things that you do, because that's effectively what we're doing in raising children. It's not me. I mean, it's you know, it pervades my entire existence, I'm afraid, for good or evil. I don't know about others. David, what about you? And
I think awareness of feedback systems and circular causality and the bizarre behaviours sometimes of, let's say, delayed feedback systems and the failure to damp feedback systems enables you to anticipate, or at least not be so surprised by situations which don't go as most people expected.
At which point we throw away the American General's playbook and we behave more like Omar's tribal leaders, because that's kind of, we're using the information about our performance in the world to modify our behavior, James, so we behave differently in order to get different results. So yes, but it's, for me, there's that information loop. Is, you know, I'm doing things, I'm prodding the world, I'm kicking it sometimes in the kneecaps, I'm getting a response from it, and I'm modifying my behavior, frankly, in order to get the things out of it that I want. And the things that I want are the things that effectively make me viable. So it is about the information flow between us as individuals and the collective us that emerges from our individual behaviors. That makes sense to anybody else? It does to me.
Is there such a thing as group evolution rather than individual evolutionary forces? I think even Dawkins has sort of modified to accepting the possibility of the former as well, which means that I think
a group evolution would surely be an emergent property of the group.
Hopefully, I would agree with you, but that was controversial once upon a time.
Probably in a Lamarckian rather than a Darwinian sense. So we're talking about Lamarckian.
Well, given that we've got memories and so on, and there's all sorts of stuff about which genes you
Peter's woken up. Look, I've woken him up. I must have said the right word.
Which genes you enact in what situation?
If you
John,
the ant's nest off enough, Peter will respond. Go on.
Well,
John Beckford. I'm sorry. I was just thinking David wanted to ask a question or say something. So. David is
I'm an eavesdropper here. However, on first contact, can you hear me?
Yeah.
On the question of first contact with cybernetics, I think I was about 14, which would be about 1968. Was Wiener, whatever you want to call him, robots with feedback, which I was very fascinated with. However, I have not really followed cybernetics, but I do think, I wonder, listening to this conversation, one, if you would consider concepts like the Markov blanket from Carl Friston as one, and that relates to a Bayesian brain hypothesis, which is very much to do with the interaction between the sensory organs and the action in the world, and that the definition of the entity of the individual is defined by the statistically determined Markov blanket, which exists between that entity and the world and relates through, on the one hand, the influence of the world on the individual through senses, and the influence of the individual on the world through action, and the feedback between the two being a Bayesian statistical error correcting process.
Can I ask what a Markov blanket is? I've heard of Markov chains and so on, and Markovian processes, but I'm ignorant here.
Well, I'm not hardly an expert on this, and you know, I'm an artist rather than a scientist. However, it seemed a very interesting way of doing some statistical work on where you will have elements which are at a center, elements that relate to the outside in a one-directional way, that's action, and the outside relating to the inside, and that's a one-way interaction mediated by the senses.
So I'm going to conclude at this point.
I'm sure the broad answer to what you said is yes.
David, I'm going to Dudley in because some years ago he wrote a paper called Food for Trees, and that's sort of popped into my head as David was describing that set of interactions between the world outside us and the world that we are. And so, Pete, I won't give the short version. You can do that for yourself.
Yeah, okay, thank you. David that's sitting with Edwina, up to the last couple of sentences, my response to what you were saying would have been yes, absolutely. I think there's a point, and it drives from Food for Trees amongst other things. I think there's a point in all of that your Markovian blanket, I think, for me, would be more the notion of identity as a relationship between some self, and you'll have to let's not do the philosophical thing. Let's just allow self to be the sort of the identity of a system and the world, and that relationship needs to work on two sets of feedbacks, which always return the function me. Otherwise, I'm dead. So I'm not convinced necessarily about the statistical nature of it, although it might be necessary for the level of modelling we're able to compute at this point in time. But I think there is a relationship. I think the relationship has to come back as literally as me. And I think that then drives a lot of sort of Bates and stuff about learning and the like being negative, being aversive. We learn the model of learning to ride a bike by learning not to fall off, rather than the positive learning of staying upright, which I think accounts for a lot of the times when we're asked what we want. It's very, very difficult to say what it is in completeness. So we tend to respond to actually experiencing what we don't want and saying that's not me, because it messes with the thing. If you remember, John, you remember the Hewitt thing where they had no positive culture till you bloody stepped over it and got your knees taken off around the coffee machine, kind of thing. And so I think yes, you're right. I think there's to some extent there might be an element of forcing the math on it, but it's as good as anything else we've got at this point in time, because it forces us to think about what we mean. So that's me done. Go on, you can all have a go now.
No, we're not going to have a go. It's nearly tea time. Look, it's 5 to 7. So I am going to call an end to proceedings on that particular note. You made me then think, Peter, about the statue that's inside the block of granite that the sculptor's got to find, and he keeps working on the block of granite until the sculptor that he wants or she wants appears for itself. So
well, yeah, this was the discussion that Brian and Vanilla and I had about the notion of identity and the perpetual freshness of the work of art, because we return to it changed. So it's a different us that sees it, so the experience is renewed in each moment. So can I just poke my nose in, seeing as I'm here and I've got the microphone? Rena, you talked about doing some work on the existential threat from AI.
Yeah, there was a talk that I organised, which was actually by Upanishad Chakrabarti, who presented the existential risks posed by AI. And
is this where I can get my eyes on it?
Is this no, not yet, because we haven't yet released the video of the recordings. Cool. But I felt as though the talk just skimmed the surface in some ways, and it needed to be expanded. So there's a great deal more to be discussed. It was more of a sort of introduction, I felt, but that each category that was covered needed to be explored in far more detail, and that's sometimes the problem with relatively short talks. Yeah. But
then, could I ask that either we pick this up at some point off so I can explore it more, or would you notify this group at some point when it is available?
Yes,
please?
Of course I will. Yes,
like to see that.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely, yes.
Thanks, guys. I'll stop now. Sorry, John.
No problem. Like the peas aren't cooked yet. We're fine. It is coming up to that stage of the day. Can I just say, first of all, thank you to Omar for all the prep that goes in, and
yeah,
as ever, we give half an hour, and one of the tasks of the good cybernetician, of course, is to conform to the 30-minute expectation of the delivery of the message. So, and it's always challenging for everybody. And yes, it was centrally imposed and entirely arbitrary. So there you go, the nature of organisation. For the conversation that has followed, I think it's been really interesting, some really thought-provoking and provocative stuff in there. So thank you all very much. Edwina and David, I do hope you'll join us again in the future. Leonardo, you've been very quiet. I assume you're still there. Thank you for attending. 12th, I think, of October, but I will stick a note out again in the next couple of days before I shove off on holiday, just to let you know when it will all be. And in December, Caitlin and I were thinking we might do a hybrid event in London somewhere where we'd have physical people interacting in a physical space, but also invite random strangers to stick their heads in on video, or like David and Avina.
Yeah, John, you might be interested. I mean, it might be possible for you to do it at our place, because we've got quite an interesting setup here. So anyway, we can communicate on that another time.
Yeah, well, let me know, because we've got access to King's College and University College London anyway.
Oh, well, that's pretty good. I mean, I don't think you can do much better than that.
Which are pretty good. But we'll see what people feel like and where they're going. So not somewhere new might be fun. So that's always good.
Well, I think King's College sounds fabulous, actually. So
the coffee's very good.
I don't think you can better that, really.
Edwina, are you the Turing Institute?
Am I what?
The Turing Institute? Or...
No.
Sorry,
no.
okay.
No, I run an art gallery, and so it's part of the sort of just talks that I'm considering curating and that sort of thing.
Well, an art gallery would be a perfectly good venue for a cybernetics event. So, at which point, thank you all very much. Thanks again, Omar. I shall speak to you all very soon, and we'll let you know when the recording comes out. See ya.
Bye.